Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm here with Chris Niebauer. He has a PhD in cognitive neuropsychology. He's currently a professor at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on consciousness, mindfulness, and artificial intelligence. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for reaching out. I really appreciate you joining in today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you have a background in neuropsychology. I would really love to know how you got started how you started exploring in consciousness, and how that sort of evolved into the realization that there is no self.
Well, it's a bit of a story, but about 19 or 20, I started having some really bad anxiety, like a continuous level of anxiety, fear of death. And it just clicked, like psychology and at the time neuroscience was really coming into kind of the next new thing. And so it just made sense to go study psychology. I thought maybe there was some there's some way to fix this neurosis, some way to fix. I was a continuous overthinker. It was like the thinking mind was just on all the time. And unless I was in deep sleep, it was just continuously playing. And so I went and got a degree in psychology. Then I specialized in grad school, focusing on the left and right sides of the brain. And I do think neuropsychology holds some really valuable lessons and great pointers. And it took me a pretty pretty far along the path, but it wasn't really doing it for me. And so I studied Eastern philosophy, probably in grad school, well, a little before grad school. As an undergrad, I started looking at Eastern philosophy. My main teacher was Alan Watts. And he introduced me to Advaita. He introduced me to Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism. He was just such a wonderful teacher to introduce me to all these different, very ancient ways to deal with the thinking mind. And I actually found them to be, in so many ways, just complementary to the neuroscience, but also in some ways, they took me much further than the neuroscience ever took me.
What are some of the similarities you noticed between neuroscience and some of these older traditions?
I think the biggest one was that, particularly in the 90s, when neuroscience was really becoming popular, it just made sense to start looking for the self in the brain. I mean, this is the thing that just from the moment we open our eyes to the moment we fall asleep, so much, particularly in the West, so much is about I, me, my ego, my story. And so it made sense that neuroscience would start looking in the brain, trying to find, okay, where is this self? Because it really seems to be something like that gravitational center to our lives. And they were just having a horrible time with it. In fact, they couldn't even discover if the self was in the left side or the right side of the brain. So there's virtually no agreement. And to this day, the neuroscience individuals who pursue this, there's just no agreement. And so that really clicked, particularly because the second lecture of the Buddha seemed to be so important to me, the no self lecture. And that just really clicked that here we have a very ancient teaching that the self is just an idea. There's no substance to it. But then we have neuroscience finding that there's no substance to the self either. And I found that to be far more than just a coincidence.
And can you give examples of some of the evidence from neuropsychology that kind of supports this idea of no self?
The strongest evidence, well, there's two pieces. One is just the fact that they've had such a hard time finding it. And there's another idea that very few people talk about, like, what if they did find it? I mean, what would that even mean? I mean, what if we did find some neural location that seems to give rise to the self, but it would still just be a bunch of cells. I mean, the brain is made up of, about 87 billion nerve cells, and all these cells do is they process information. So even if we did find a particular part of the brain that became active every time we got involved with the self or thought about the self or processed the self, it still wouldn't be very convincing to me, because that's still just a bunch of neurons. So, the quest in neuroscience to find the self is a bit strange in many ways. But the most convincing data, the stuff that I still lecture on today, and what I think is actually something, because when I talk about this, sometimes people say, well, that's old neuroscience. That's neuroscience from the 60s and 70s. And in my view, you're right. It is from the 60s and 70s, but our general culture has not embraced it yet. We have not really felt at a deep level what this research means. And the research was on split brain patients. And the research on split brain patients, the reason it's so important is because it doesn't find the self at all. But what it does find is the part of the brain that creates the idea of a self. Because when you hear people say, well, there is no self, the self is just an illusion. Well, it doesn't feel like one. And if you suffer from neurosis, or you suffer from anxiety or depression, and then you just say, well, the self is just an illusion, they're going to give you a really strange look, because they're going to be, I don't believe you, because this self feels very real and it feels very, heavy. And when they did the research on the split brain patients, and it's exactly what it sounds like. So one of the most interesting things about the brain that a kid will even pick up on is that if you look at it, it's not one big brain. There's two very discrete anatomical centers, one on the left side and one on the right, and they share their own blood supply. They really are different centers of processing, and they are connected by a structure that is about 800 million nerve fibers. It's called the corpus callosum. So that's a very interesting thing for nature to create. Why doesn't nature just have us with one big brain? Nature has evolved two separate brains, but then interconnected them so they're very tightly interconnected. In the split brain patients, they surgically go in and sever that connection, and the connection doesn't grow back. So the two sides of the brain are absolutely isolated. And what they found with these split brain patients, the fascinating thing is that when they would send messages to the right side of the brain, something like stand up or maybe raise your hand. And then they would ask the left brain, so language, me talking to you right now and you talking to me, that's almost entirely accomplished by a small part in the left side of the brain. So when these split brain patients are talking, they're using the left side of the brain. And so they send a command to the right side of the brain, something like raise your hand, and the patient did it. Now, the left side of the brain is clueless. It has no idea why this just happened. But the most fascinating thing about it is they effortlessly, spontaneously, their left brain jumped online and created a story to explain why their hand was in the air. And I find that to be so important for our species, for humanity to embrace at this point. We have a part of our brain that makes up stories. It confabulates. It tries to take the data the best that it can, and it builds a story around it. And of course, that is really similar to what we see with the self. The self is a story that the left side of the brain creates. It's very prone to being wrong. So it makes up stories, and what they found with these split brain patients is how often they were wrong. So they might raise their hand, and when they asked them, again, they asked the left side of the brain, well, why did you just raise their hand? Not a single split brain patient has said, I don't know. Their left brain doesn't know. It's clueless. This message went to the right side of the brain. It was the right side of the brain that did the command. So the left side is absolutely in the dark, and it should have said that. It should have said, I don't know, but it didn't. It made up a story. It said, oh, my arm fell asleep and I had to stretch. Something, and they did this in so many different studies where the patients just so effortlessly made up a convincing story. And that's what we are. That's what the self is. That's what the ego is. It's a really convincing story that is created by the left side of the brain. And it's doing the best it can based on the evidence it gets. But that the split brain patients were really the first, in my opinion, to demonstrate how there's a part of the brain that's so creative, so much confabulation, that as a species, we kind of need to step back for a little bit and say, in philosophy, they have this idea called naive realism. That's just, we perceive the world as it is. And so many of us are under that spell still. We think that we see the world as the world really is. What the split brain patients were able to show us is that we see the world the way we perceive, the story we tell is how we see the world. That whatever the left brain is making up, that's what we experience as reality. We are our stories about reality, not actual reality. And I think that's something that I'm sure the research might be old. It might be 50 years old. But I don't think like the ordinary person, I don't think the ordinary person has been exposed to this and realizes this. And so that's what I spend time with and try to get that message out, that there's a part of the brain that is very prone to making up stories. And there's a chance that's what you think you are. You are a story created by the left side of the brain.
And if these stories are like fearful stories, it can become like really heavy. It can become like a heavy experience.
That's the thing about the stories. And again, sometimes the stories are wonderful and we feel very good about ourselves, but the stories can change very radically. And they can become really terrifying. And then of course, really the thing we worry about so much is, now that you've got this story going, you start wondering, what if it ends? What happens when the story ends? And for me, that was my most terrifying thought, death. I kept thinking, at any moment I could die. And it was such a terrifying thought until I started to realize that, well, this thing that I'm worried about is just a story. It's just an invention of the left side of the brain. It's not even there in the first place. So why am I so worried about it dying? And then I started to see a little bit of a shift in all that.
Yeah, it's kind of like a death before the actual death.
It is. It's a continuous. That's the problem with the story. If we could simply turn it on and off, it's a useful story. Like, we refer to each other by our names and, and I pay my bills, and there's a practical sense to this story and it works. But like so many things in life, if you take it too seriously, it's like, I often tell the story about being at the airport and if you just pick up a bunch of luggage, it's so heavy. And it's not even your luggage and you're just carrying it around. And so I spent so much of my time carrying around this luggage of the ego, and it's heavy and it's serious. It's dreadfully serious. And so I ended up shifting from what was such a serious left side processing to the right side of the brain. And the right side of the brain is far less serious. It's far more playful, and it's far less likely to get caught up in stories and language. And so for me, that was a much more peaceful, pleasant experience. And so that's what I ended up doing with the book. I ended up writing about shifting our consciousness from being possessed in this left brain mode of processing, shifting it over so we can appreciate and experience the absolute joy and bliss and just everything is fine as it is of the right side of the brain. And that's just it's a shift that I think is it's a good time for this shift.
Yeah, it's really liberating, and it feels lighter when you start noticing yourself that you're engaging in a story and start disentangling yourself from that. It's and not get like too identified with it.
That's a great way to put it. You know, when I do this practice with my students, I start teaching them about the left side of the brain. It's actually called the left brain interpreter because it interprets our environment and creates stories to explain it. And I teach them how the interpreter is always on. And it's just, I mean, you could just be walking down the hallway, and if you see some people laughing, the interpreter starts talking. Are they laughing at me? You know, anything unusual that happens, or even when nothing is happening, when you're just sitting here, the interpreter comes in and says, well, I'm bored. Let's find something different. Let's be entertained. And so it's that interpreter that's continuously processing the world around it, so much so. And it does, and when students start to disidentify with the interpreter, which is to say, they start to notice it. And instead of being it, they start stepping back a little bit. And there's all kinds of practices and hints I give in the book where there are ways that you can begin to observe the interpreter rather than being identified with it. And for some people, many people, the interpreter still goes on and it still does its thing. It simply doesn't really affect them very much because they know that it's not who they really are.
Yeah, I think that's a really big step in even just noticing that that's happening. In one of your talks, I noticed, and correct me if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, wrong. I noticed you talked about how there is no objective world, like all the colors and objects are getting generated in the brain. So do you resonate with the idea that there's nothing really outside, it's all getting generated in the brain?
It's a great question. And I usually do these more as practices, because one of the things about the left side of the brain is it's highly identified with what I call the thinking mind. And people use various definitions of this. If you go back to the ancient traditions, they just call it mind. But they were very aware that we have a processing center that is about strategy. It's about, you know, navigating our way in this world. It's about survival. And one of the conclusions, if there are any conclusions, I'm not very serious about any conclusions. I think most of what we talk about, especially when we talk about non-duality, it's all tentative because we're coming at it, when we talk about it, we're coming at it through this thinking mind perspective. However, one of the things that science has been able to show us is that to a degree that we've never realized, we are, again, to go back to naive realism, we thought we saw the world as it is, that the world was out there. And we didn't realize how active we are in this creation. So things like color, this is one of the things that my students seem to enjoy the most, because I think it's the most dramatic example. If you look out into the world, it absolutely seems like color is part of the external world. If you look at this, you know, yellow pencil, it's like, well, obviously it's a yellow pencil. And that's the way so many people think about the world. But the fascinating thing is that neuroscience has actually shown us that, and not just neuroscience, actually, this goes all the way back to Isaac Newton. Newton himself recognized that there are just wavelengths of energy, and that he even said that the wavelengths themselves have no color. So even, you know, back in Newton's time, there was this recognition that color is a, well, the neuroscientists would say that color is produced in the brain, and they even have different areas that seem to produce color, and they reason that because when a person has a stroke in this area, they lose the ability to process color. But the fascinating thing about neuroscience and color is we can push it a little further. We can ask, where is color? Because it's clearly not out there in physical reality. There's just wavelengths of energy. But then where is it in the brain? So when I look at this yellow pencil, is the yellow somewhere up in that color processing center? But when you look at that color processing center, there's no color there either. It's just more cells. So it pushes a really interesting question. So, okay, color isn't part of the physical world. Color isn't in my brain. So where is color? And when that's that kind of question that begins this process of questioning how much is really out in the external world. So you can start with color, and then we can move along and we can say, okay, well, how deep is the rabbit hole? If color isn't part of the external world, well, what else isn't part of the external world? How about shape? How about something as simple as movement? And it turns out one of the interesting things neuroscience has been able to demonstrate is so many things that we think are out there in the world are really being processed by the brain. And just to give you another example with movement. So imagine I'm looking at upward movement. There are certain cells that fire discretely to upward movement. And what they've been able to do in the lab is when they train animals to respond in a way to upward movement, if they go in and stimulate the cells for downward movement, the animal will actually perceive downward motion. And so again, this is why so many neuroscientists are so convinced it all comes together in the brain. This is why neuroscience is so powerful right now. So many things in the outside world seem to be really going on in the brain, but in my view, I like to push it a little bit further and question whether we should even stop with the brain. Are the things that we experience consciously that are not part of the physical world, they're not part of the brain, well, where are they then? And I think that's where it takes us to this interesting place called consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's a really key realization, because if it's not happening in the outside world, it may not be as rigid as we think it is, and that could open up a lot of possibilities which we've been holding on, that these are all rigid concepts that are unchangeable. So it now opens up the possibility that maybe they can be changed.
And we're far more a part of our we're far more a part of the world than we had previously realized. So many of us, we feel so disconnected and we feel like we're just not part of things. When you start realizing that the world that you think is out there, you're more of an artist than you think. You're creating these images and you're creating your perceptions. And so it puts you far more of an artist than simply this passive recipient of the external world, just imposing its reality on you. And that's really important, because when you start thinking of yourself as an artist, that ties into creativity. That ties into like, well, how much of this, how creative am I with my experience? What are the limits of my creativity? How much play do I get with this experience as a human being?
What do you think is the potential of this insight? Like if if it becomes more and more mainstream, that we accept that it's consciousness, everything is consciousness. How do you foresee that as transforming our worldview in future?
I think one of the fascinating ways is that it will unite humanity in a way that is unprecedented. So one of the things about this thinking mind that not a lot of people go into is its origins. And so one of the things I like to do, and I'm exploring this in another book I have coming out soon, is, I'll explain the neuroscience and I'll explain this illusion of self. And then people ask, well, why? Why do we have this illusion of, what function does it serve? And that's when I go back a little bit and remind people that, human beings, we've been on the planet for a couple million years, but our version, Homo sapiens, I mean, we've only been around a few 100,000 years, which isn't very long. And there were all kinds of other humans on this planet. So Homo sapiens, there were Homo erectus, Neanderthal, there were all kinds of other humans that were sharing the planet together. And there's different theories on this, but Homo sapiens won this evolutionary competition. And so you can look around and you will not find any of these other versions today. And that's because about 70,000 years ago, this thinking program in our species became really advanced. It became really good at abstractions, and it became really good at in-group and out-group. So I was able to form an in-group, and then I could have people that I felt. So that's the interesting thing about the self. It's not always just an ego in my skull. It can extend out to my group identity. And as a species, we had this group identity, and the other forms of humanity didn't. So we were able to work collectively, and that was something that the other forms of humanity couldn't compete with. But we did this on the basis of how we look out into the world, and we see us versus them. And so one of the ways that the thinking mind works is through categorization. In fact, I think categorization is the dominant way the thinking mind works. I think it's virtually impossible to think without thinking in categories. Now, the interesting thing about categories is that they are fictions of the mind, that they're not really out there in the world. And so think about like maybe watching a sporting event. And so you'll have two teams, and the teams where, team one will wear like a green sweater or shirt or whatever, and team two will wear, say, blue sweatshirt. And so you've got two different colors. And so one of the things our thinking mind excels at, it's so good at this, is it can take one common feature and group those together. So we can watch and we'll only see two teams. And that makes the sporting a lot easier to be entertained by. But we don't realize that in reality, there are just people out there. Just because, I'm wearing a green shirt and you're wearing a green shirt, the thinking mind might connect us and put us in the same group, but that's an illusion. That's not true. It's just taking one common feature, and that's what categorization does. It takes, so the world is think about reality. It's a wiggly place with all kinds of, there's not a lot of straight edges, and it's just a messy place. So what the thinking mind does is it cleans all that up, and it will focus on one quality, and that's how it forms groups. It ignores everything else and focuses on that one quality. Well, that was a really powerful thing a few 70,000 years ago. And it was but we don't need this tool any longer. And so when we see through the processes of categorization, when we see through the thinking mind, when we see the mechanics of how the thinking mind makes it look like maybe you and I are on the same team, but then this other person isn't, when we realize that all that is just a story and that our true essence goes beyond the categories created by the thinking mind, I think humanity has a really good chance of uniting in a way that it's never actually experienced, because we may still have those thoughts that form groups, but we won't believe in them anymore. We'll recognize that I have my story going on in my left brain, you have your story going on in your left brain, but those differences are rather trivial, that we actually share something far more important than the stories that our left brain is creating.
I think that's a really great potential to aspire for. I also hear about some people talking about the potential of consciousness as technology, using consciousness as like technology. Is that something that you see happening in future?
I do teach a class on artificial intelligence, and I do enjoy talking about artificial intelligence. It's a very interesting time because artificial intelligence is like when I have a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old, and their world is just different than mine because they're surrounded by very intelligent machines. From my perspective, though, these intelligent machines are doing what our thinking mind does. They're very good at pattern perception, so they can recognize faces. They're very good at categorization. It's pretty remarkable that an artificial intelligence can read my handwriting, particularly mine. And so it's very impressive. But what degree does that have to what degree does that have to do with consciousness? So this is just from my perspective, but in my work, one of the, because I also teach a class on consciousness, and one of the main points that I make in my class, and it's a point that I like to discuss even with the consciousness crowd, because I think it's the biggest mistake that is taking place in the consciousness research, and that is to confuse the thinking mind with consciousness. And the thinking mind is all about strategy. It's about getting results. It uses language. It solves problems. And in order to solve problems, it's very good at pattern perception. And all of these are things that artificial intelligence are getting really, really good at. To what degree that actually speaks to consciousness, I always take a nice long pause and just breathe. And I'm not particularly convinced that that has a whole lot to do with consciousness. At least on my path and my journey, what I found is that back when I was very caught up in the thinking mind, I had experiences of distancing myself from the thinking mind. And they were beautiful experiences it was just simple consciousness. It was consciousness with no strategy. It was consciousness that had no future or past. It had no personality. It wasn't concerned with my story. And so I think consciousness is actually quite a bit different than the thinking mind. And one of the things I like to talk about, particularly with neurotypes or consciousness groups, or even with non-duality groups, is to just bring that up as a pointer, that the thinking mind is a great tool and it can help, but that's all it is. And one of the main problems we've gotten into as a society is that we suffer from a thinking problem. So many of us overthink, and the way we think we can fix this is by more thinking. And so we add, fuel to the fire. We try to fix a thinking problem with more thinking, and then we wonder why it isn't working. So one of the things I do in No Self, No Problem is give people exercises so they can experience for themselves what non-thinking is all about, what consciousness without thought is all about. And the fascinating thing about it is we don't think as much as we think we think. And I know that sounds weird, but while we are suffering from a thinking problem, many of us have experiences of this non-linguistic, non-thinking consciousness. And they're beautiful experiences, but when the thinking mind comes back online, it tends to trivialize it. So we may go for a walk through the woods and we're on the beach and we stop thinking for a little bit, and we're in the now, and we're having a beautiful experience, and it feels very relaxing. And it's like dropping all that heaviness, and when we put all that baggage down, and then we walk away and we start thinking again. And once we start thinking again, then the thinking mind trivializes these experiences. And if we want this, if the shift is going to happen, there has to be a revaluing of these non-linguistic, non-thinking experiences. And you can do this. To just give you a simple example, I was just in a storm a little bit ago, and there's this consciousness is a very playful. I think that the ultimate nature of the universe is very humor-based. I think it's very funny. I think it likes to play. And, it could start raining, and you may really have this desire to just go dancing in the rain and singing some strange song. But the left brain will come along and say, well, don't do that. That's silly, And so I think a lot of us would sing and dance a lot more. We would play a lot more music. We would play a lot more if we distance ourselves just a little bit from the thinking mind.
I think you described it very beautifully, Chris, and I resonate with you. It seems like the technology kind of is like a reflection of our collective consciousness, which if that's stuck on thinking mind level, even our technology will reflect that same level of consciousness. And hopefully, if the shift happens, our technology will reflect that shift.
It's such an interesting time in the sense that people like Elon Musk, people sort of at the very pinnacle of the progress in AI, come right out and then they warn us about AI. And I think that's interesting because I can't help but to think that AI, artificial intelligence, and the thinking mind do have a connection with each other. And in some ways, I think what they're warning us about is we're giving the thinking mind another voice. We're giving the thinking mind a bigger role in our lives. And that's why you see a very collective effort where people want to turn off their phones and go into the woods for a little bit. I think that's actually quite a good idea. I think connecting with nature, it really does help to slow the thinking mind, just to be in nature for a very short time. And being around technology, it's a useful tool. It can help us. Some of it's very cool stuff, but at the same time, I think it tends to amplify the thinking mind. And that's why a lot of we see with kids so much anxiety, the more they seem to be. And there's even this thing, I guess nomophobia is a new type of phobia where people fear loss of their cell phone. They become very terrified that they're going to lose their cell phone or they won't have cell phone access. And those kinds of fears and those kinds of anxieties, again, seem really connected with that old program of the thinking mind.
And when you have an academic background, do you see any change in attitude towards the subjects? Because usually it gets dismissed as like some woo-woo knowledge. And do you see that's changing, or it's going to change where it's going to be seen a bit more, taken more seriously?
I actually got to experience this firsthand. I was in academia since the 80s as a student, and I really got to watch consciousness go from a very taboo subject that was associated with, it wasn't very legitimate. And I got to watch that transform to the point that studying consciousness is something that is shifted so much from the peripheral to almost center stage. I think I actually ask my students this. I say, how do you feel about your professor studying consciousness? And they all think it's cool. They all think it's a really good, for them, it's just sort of a natural thing. So we've made consciousness something that we can talk about. Now, again, there's still a lot of disagreement about exactly what consciousness is, but the conversation is there. And as an academic, you can build a career around it and I think be very successful. And that's really different than 30 years ago.
And now that we hopefully we can talk about the benefits, about we can identify the benefits of having this knowledge or realizing this kind of knowledge, like more sense of peace and harmony. And hopefully those kind of things will give it more legitimacy.
Yeah, I think the fascinating thing is that when it comes to consciousness, we're starting to realize that's far more who we are than all these thinking processes that are going on. And so, we're all on this quest. Who am I? Know thyself. Human beings have been doing that quest for a very long time. And for the majority of it, we thought we were our thinking mind. The old Descartes, I think, therefore I am, reflects how much we identify ourselves as the process of thinking. And the shift is that we're recognizing that actually most of our thinking has very little to do with who we are. It's just a collective program. It's a very old program. People are realizing that the voice in their head, well, did you invent the language? Did you invent the things that you're worrying about? Did you invent any of the things that make you anxious? Did you invent these? No, they're just part of a program. They have very little to do with you. And so that shift it's really an identity shift where we're disidentifying with the thinking mind, the left side of the brain, and shifting over to so many processes of the right brain that are so much closer to who we actually are as a species, but just as a human being having these experiences.
And who knows, maybe it could go in the direction where not talking about seeing consciousness as some, or dismissing it would be seen as closed-mindedness, and a backward way of thinking more.
I think that is already happening a little bit. I think if you had, say, a social science department or, say, a psychology department that didn't teach a class on consciousness, I think right now that would start to be a little bit unusual. And that would start to be kind of like, well, consciousness is probably one of the most popular topics. And I don't want to say it too much because obviously I'm biased because I talk about this and I'm sure that's all I see. But yeah, we might be there a little closer, I think.
And when you hear about these talks in the non-duality groups, what's your overall impression about what's talked in those groups? Are there things that resonate with you, and are there things that don't resonate with you?
Well, I think when you start exploring this big question of who am I, and you start recognizing the processes of the left brain and become very good at recognizing the thinking mind, there's a natural shift from ego to non-ego. And you start experiencing consciousness in a very non-dualistic way. So I think that as soon as you shift and you have the experience of no self, and this is one of the things I should talk about with the left brain, because the left brain excels at categories. One of the things categories do is they divide the world up. They continuously create groups that are separate from one another. It has nothing to do with building bridges or connecting. In fact, the left side of the brain does the exact opposite. It deconstructs, it takes apart, it finds groups that are separate. When you shift over to the right brain, one of the things about right brain processing is it is so much more interconnective. It sees the way things are connected. It sees the big picture. And when you start having those experiences, non-duality is it almost feels like a normal thing. In fact, I've often wondered how it is that we start with non-duality. I mean, to me, it just seems like or how we start with duality, because it seems like non-duality seems like the default mode. It seems like the most normal thing. And I think we came into the world like this. I think our first experiences when we were born, this first couple years of life, we experienced an interconnected, even our senses were interconnected. So the synesthesia is where all the senses seem interconnected. And there's some theories that suggest that we're all born with synesthesia. And then when we're about 2, that's when we start kicking in this categorical processing, that's when the world starts to separate. And that's when we separate us versus them, me versus you. And so I would say that the experience of non-duality is actually more natural. It's our natural state. And then we impose duality onto that. So I think for many people, it feels like coming home. It feels like this is my place. And so I like to think of non-duality as home, and then duality is a place you visit. You have to go to work and you have to pay bills, and people refer to me as Chris. And so all the duality comes back online. And I do this. I pay bills, and I get in my car. I don't just get into someone else's car. And so duality is there's a practical sense to it. It's a nice place to visit. But I really feel that neuroscience is going to show us eventually not who we are. I think neuroscience is going to be excellent at showing us who we are not. And once we get beyond who we are not, then we'll start having these experiences of non-duality, and it's going to feel like home, and it's going to bring human beings together in a way that we've never quite experienced before.
Yeah, it does feel like coming home. That sense of separation starts diminishing more and more.
And even when you have it, even when it kicks in for some reason, it just doesn't seem to take hold like it used to. And so, if someone steals your parking place, you might have that kind of like little reaction, but it's very trivial. And you go back to sensing the connectedness rather than the disconnect. And it's very possible that non-duality was the experience of our ancestors. And so we see there's an interesting thing that happened in human history, where the more we started thinking, that's when you saw shamanism starting to appear all over the planet. And shamanism could have been a response to the thinking mind, to kind of keep us home, keep us, grounded in our actual non-duality existence. And that's what you see. All the modern shamans are people who just remind us, you're not who you think you are. That's just a thought. You transcend that, and your genuine self is a mystery. It's a mystery to the thinking mind, because the thinking mind is extremely limited, and we're catching up to this right now. We're beginning to realize that if we go back 100 years, the thinking mind was so arrogant, it believed that we had the whole universe figured out. We just had to go a few decimal places, and the whole universe would be known to the thinking mind. And then, the universe throws some interesting things at us, like quantum mechanics, which is so far beyond our ability to think that even experts in the field admit we don't understand it. We don't understand. There's so many wonderful complexities that the thinking mind just has such a difficult time dealing with. It cannot deal with it. That our place in the universe, our place is shifting, I think, from one of kind of an egotistical arrogance to a very humble position that feels like it feels like we're home, because we feel so connected, and we're focused on the connections between people rather than these trivial differences associated with the body and the categorical mind.
And what's your take on the radical non-duality, where sometimes there is a tendency to dismiss the personality, or sometimes there can be too much of stress on the absolute, that the relative gets dismissed. What's your take on that?
There's so many. I like the idea that there's so many paths to the top of the mountain. And so there's a lot of ways to get there. And I think a lot of us, just like we like different types of music, we may have a slight preference for one path What I like is something I might have come up with this, I don't know, I call it non-duality light. It's sort of the opposite of radical non-duality. And what I talk about when I talk about with students or when I write about it, non-duality light is really having, to be metaphorical, like one foot in each world. So home is this non-duality, and you know that you're home, but you still have another foot in the practical matters of life. And so you may still have a job, and you may even, at times, when it feels right, you may even take it seriously. And so I have a project coming up, and I probably have to spend all day tomorrow on it. Now, from a non-duality perspective, whether I do it or not isn't terribly important. But I do think, like, even though the sense of self is an illusion, again, there's a practical sense where, as long as you're using the tool in the right way, I think you could have a pretty balanced life. And so when I talk about non-duality, I've had experiences that, from my personal view, absolutely convinced me that the division, separateness, that all that is just an illusion of the thinking mind. But that illusion of the thinking mind does have a certain purpose, and it has a certain function. And so when it comes to non-duality, I always have three questions that I talk about. And so the first is like, well, if non-duality is our existence, why are we having such a dualistic experience? And the second is, since we're having this non-dual experience, can we get, excuse me, let me rephrase that. Since we're having this experience in duality, so many of us, that's our kind of, most people have that experience. Can we get to non-duality from duality? And the third one, I think, is the most important one. Like, are we ready for non-duality? And I think that third one answers itself. We're not ready to jump completely into the ocean of non-duality. If we were, we would be there. That's the whole idea. If we were ready for non-duality to come across collectively 100%, we would do it. Because it would be our choice. So we're hanging on to aspects of duality, and maybe it will take a little time, or maybe we're just having fun with duality. There are things about duality that are very interesting. So that, getting back to that first question, it's like, okay, well, if everything is interconnected and one and non-dual, then why do we have this experience of duality? And there's all kinds of things you can do as a separate me. And like, when we bring separateness into the world, it's caused a lot of chaos and suffering. Yes, that's absolutely true. But it's also caused a lot of, it's an interesting exploration. And in the book, I give a very specific example. So imagine everything is one. So we live in an absolutely non-dualistic reality. It would be really difficult to have fun at a casino. You're both the casino owner, and you're also the person playing, you're everything. And so if you win, you lose. If you lose, you win. There's no way to really win. If you go in with this illusion, so you create the illusion and say, I'm going to forget who I really am, and I'm just going to be this little Chris. I'm going to be this little me. If you can forget who you really are and identify with this ego, there's a lot of suffering that comes from that. That's true. But there's also some very fascinating things that also do come from that. You can go into the casino and believe that you're winning. You can have that excitement and think, wow, there are winners and losers, and that can be very exciting. And that's why we might be having these experiences. It's always interesting. You can't tickle yourself. You need someone else to tickle you. You can't surprise yourself. It's like, to me, it's a wonderful sensation right now that I don't know what you're going to say, and I don't know what's going to happen in the next few seconds. But if we're this one all-encompassing non-dual consciousness, you always know. what's happening. You always know what's going to happen. And time is an illusion. So we bring time, we bring all these illusions because the fundamental nature of reality is play. It's fun. It just oftentimes may not seem like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like an adventurous exploration. You can explore so many different feelings, experiences. So it's it's like a virtual reality.
It's how do you experience loss, and how do you experience missing someone? And so the dual experiences that we're having, again, create lots of suffering on the planet. But one has to ask, well, like, why are we having them? And I always point to some of the really fun, exciting, surprising things that you can do if you live in a dream. Like, it's like a dream, that's what we're having here. We're like non-dualistic reality, living a dream of dualism. And in that dream, we can have exciting adventures, and they have to be thought of as real, or they wouldn't be exciting. So yeah, there's danger and there's suffering, but it's the same thing that we do. Like, we go to, we watch a scary movie, and so we like, it's. I think the nature of reality is very playful, and it likes adventure, and it likes to get lost and really things we may not think that it could possibly be involved with. And so, that's just a couple of things I like to play around with when it comes to non-duality, because it is interesting. Of course, non-duality has been around for thousands of years, but it's fascinating that neuroscience finally started picking up on it, and science started picking up on it. And so this isn't like it was 30 years ago. In the same way consciousness was taboo, the idea of non-duality is becoming far more acceptable. And so maybe we want to take a break from playing dualism, or maybe, I don't know.
I want to be, I want to make sure I don't take up too much of your time. I wanted to ask this one question before we wrap up. I thought it would be really interesting to get feedback from someone of your background, from neuropsychology. What is your take on things like psychic abilities and intuition?
One way to look at that is that as we continue to explore the thinking mind, and this goes back to 1967. So a cognitive psychologist defined cognitive psychology, and it was a wonderful way to define it. He said that cognition, our thoughts, is when we take reality and we transform it. We expand, we delete. And so the thinking mind is really dealing with a very edited version of reality. And it's a very, just like a director cuts all kinds of things and adds things. When we get caught up in the thinking mind, that's the world that we experience. And I'm very, very open to ideas of the paranormal, to ideas of, I guess I could put it this way: reality, whatever it is, it's far more than what you think it is. And so I personally am quite open. I've had many experiences of synchronicity. They're some of my favorite things that happen to me. And I think that those are hints, kind of breadcrumbs that we left ourselves so we can find our way back home to this non-dual basis of existence. And when we get there, we'll find that there are lots of interesting, strange connections that the thinking mind was absolutely unaware of. And so I think it's through these connections that the thinking mind is ignorant to, or you could say it just ignores them. It just devalues them. And it's through these connections that we see things like synchronicity and things we might call paranormal. And again, you could find some very serious thinking minds that, in particular, well, so in No Self, I threw out a couple interesting paranormal stories, and it's interesting to see those are the ones I think, I got some very good, very interesting reactions from thinking minds, because this notion that the thinking mind just has been so arrogant, it really can't, it has a very difficult time even imagining that reality could be more than it's capable of thinking. But I'm going to guess this is where we're going. We're realizing the limitations of the thinking mind. And so we may find that there is a basis to intuition. There's a basis to many paranormal experiences. And these will be humbling experiences to the thinking mind, because we always want to think that, okay, if I'm solving a problem, my thinking mind is the one doing it. But there's been so many examples. I mean, look how many Nobel Prizes just happened by accidents or intuitions. And some of the really interesting discoveries are when we go beyond the thinking mind, kind of open our heart to something much more vast and extensive than the thinking mind can imagine. And that's when we really find some beautiful creativity. Because when it comes to, well, think about it again, creativity, the thinking mind would love to take credit for something new, something creative, but it's very rare that the thinking mind ever comes up with these. It's more that the thinking mind writes it down and then tells everyone, but it really came from something that was far beyond thought. And we owe a lot to intuition, but the thinking mind still is trying to take credit for it.
And there can be so much, like so many application in case like it starts unfolding more, and if these abilities are really possible, in some cases it can be life-saving for some people to have these kind of intuition or psychic abilities. So
yeah, that's a great point. That in particularly in Western culture, we're taught to dismiss them, so we don't really train them very well. And intuition is something I think that that can be refined. It's a process that you can become better at, and sometimes they can be life-saving experiences. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where intuition and parapsychology is another one you can talk about. Again, a very interesting shift where 30 years ago, even I would teach a class in my intro class, and I pretty much dismissed parapsychology because it just seemed like, well, the way the research is, and again, but all the research was very particular. It was very, selective. And the more I began to disidentify with the thinking mind, all of a sudden I had a whole new respect for particularly intuition, but also experiences of parapsychological nature.
I'm really grateful, Chris, that someone like you from neuroscience background has joined in today too, and explained all these concepts so clearly. I think this was a really informative conversation for me personally. I don't know if I missed anything, if there was something you wanted to share today that we were not able to cover, if you want to.
Oh, nothing in particular. I think we've had a good talk and I enjoyed it very much. And I really like this. It's very appealing that non-duality is becoming so, I wouldn't put it mainstream, not quite yet, but I think that just the possibility, so one of the ways I talk about, just maybe on a final note, one of the ways I talk about the left and right sides of the brain is the left brain is terribly serious. And it has to, because language, if it's going to convince us that words are real, it has to take a very serious attitude. And the right brain is very much into play, but it's also into this idea I call flirtation or flirting. And so maybe the idea of non-duality, and maybe it's too much right now. But so what I ask my students and I ask my readers, I say, well, don't take it seriously. Just flirt with it a little bit, play with it, have a flirtation with non-duality, and then you'll see some really interesting things happen, because that being serious is very much caught up with the self. It's caught up with the idea of duality. And if you can just play with things a little bit more, I think things will naturally, it'll feel more comfortable to consider possibly the interconnectedness of consciousness, and that we may look very different on the surface, and we may have very different egos, but all those identities, when all those fictions go away, we're left with our true essence, and it's just one interconnected consciousness.
Yeah, and there are so many resources available now versus in older days. Like there were only like few gurus that you could go and meet in person, but now it's accessible easily online.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the work that you do. This is, I mean, you can go on YouTube now and find people like you who talk about non-duality, and that's introducing it to so many people particularly in the West. It's such a new idea. It's such a new to not think. I mean, we're so caught up with thinking being the pinnacle of our existence, and then I tell people, well, take a break from thinking, see what happens. And they come back and they say, yeah, it was pretty wonderful to not think for a little bit.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think I personally like your style of communication. You're very easy to understand and articulate. You are able to break down things in a way that it's very easy to process. So thank you for.
Thank you. And being a professor for a while, that's always been a real help for me, because that's what I've been doing for a while. And so now when I started playing around with consciousness and non-duality, it can be challenging, because the thinking mind is it's a difficult obstacle, but as the Stoics put it, the obstacle is the way. So you start learning about the thinking mind, you learn to catch it when it engages. And so thank you.
And if people want to contact you or find out more about you, is your YouTube channel the main?
It seems to be the place I explore the most. It's kind of a place I have the most fun, because I just go off on really whatever I feel like going off on. But I do have this Chris Niebauer Ph.D., which is just my web page, and I have something on Facebook called Catching Up with Buddhism, and that I spend a little bit of time on that too.
Thank you. And I also want to thank the audience